At 57 years old, the terrifying crimes of Chuck Knoblauch are no longer something the baseball world can quietly fold away inside a stat sheet. For years, the soft phrase used to describe what he did was legal troubles. Two polite words that made something ugly sound like a parking ticket. But that phrase does not reflect what the police affidavits say. It does not reflect what the officers saw when they walked into those rooms. It does not reflect what happened to the women who trusted him. This is not only a baseball story. This is the story of how a man who had every advantage that this world can give a person made a series of choices that stripped him of everything his talent had built. And the question that follows his name at 57 is not what happened to his arm in New York. The question is, how does someone with that much go that far in the wrong direction? He had the championship rings. He had the stolen base records. He had the All-Star nods and the Gold Glove and the love of an entire city. Coaches used his name as a teaching tool. Television commentators gave him a nickname that said it all: fundamentally sound. He was the standard. If this story already has your attention, go ahead and tap the hype button right now and hype this video. It only takes a second, and it helps more people find stories like this one. Now let us go all the way back to the beginning, because you need to see exactly how high he was before you can understand how far he fell. Chuck Knoblauch was born in Houston, Texas, into a family where baseball was not a hobby or a seasonal interest. It was the air the family breathed. His father, Ray Knoblauch, had spent time in the minor leagues. His uncle, Eddie Knoblauch, did the same. Both men managed and played at that level during the middle of the 20th century. Growing up in that house meant growing up inside the game. The vocabulary of it, the mechanics of it, the discipline of it, all of it was present from the time Chuck was old enough to pick up a ball. Most kids his age were learning the rules of the sport. He was already learning the details that separate good players from great ones. He learned the footwork for turning a double play before most of his peers understood why you needed to turn it. He understood the craft of getting on base, not just the glamour of swinging hard, before his Little League coaches had a chance to explain it. Baseball was not something he had to be taught the way other kids were taught. It was something he had been absorbing, passively and actively, from the very beginning of his life. By the time he arrived at Bel Air High School in Houston, the separation was obvious. His instincts on the field were ahead of his peers by years. His footwork was clean. His hands were reliable. His baseball IQ was something you could not teach in an afternoon. He played the game the way someone plays when it has been running in their mind since childhood. And then, in what should have been his defining senior season, a catastrophic thing happened. He broke his leg. The injury ended his season before it could become anything. He could not play. He could not contribute on the field. And yet, he showed up. He was there at practices. He was there at games. He sat on that bench and supported his teammates through the pain of his own absence while they went on to win the state championship. That level of commitment to something bigger than yourself is the mark of a certain kind of person. That is the version of Chuck Knoblauch that the people of Minnesota fell in love with. That is the version that makes everything that came later so much harder to process. From Bel Air, he carried that identity to Texas A&M University, where he became one of the most respected college infielders in the country. He earned second-team All-American recognition. He was a central figure on the 1989 Aggie squad that put together a school-record 58 wins in a single season. 58 victories. That kind of season is built on collective excellence, and Knoblauch was at the heart of it. He spent the summer of 1988 competing in the Cape Cod Baseball League, widely considered the most prestigious summer circuit for amateur talent in the country. He played for the Wareham Gatemen, and he did not just survive the competition. He won the Outstanding Pro Prospect Award for the entire league. Every professional scout with a notepad left that summer with his name circled at the top of their list. In the 1989 Major League Baseball draft, the Minnesota Twins selected him with the 25th overall pick. He was 21 years old, and the sport he had been preparing for his entire life was finally ready to receive him. His arrival in the major leagues was not a slow build. It was immediate and electric. Chuck Knoblauch made his debut on April 9, 1991, and stepped directly into a story that Minnesota fans would talk about for the rest of their lives. He batted .281 in his rookie season. He was sharp, disciplined, creative on the bases, and trustworthy with the glove. His presence in the lineup changed the energy of every at-bat that followed him. When he got on base, pitchers had to think about him. When he ran, entire defenses had to shift. He made himself a problem before the big hitters behind him even lifted their bats. He won the American League Rookie of the Year award. But more than any individual honor, he became the heartbeat of a Minnesota Twins team that was about to do something almost no team in baseball history had done. They had finished last in the American League West in 1990. They won the World Series in 1991, worst to first. The complete reversal of an entire franchise's fortunes in a single season. One of the most celebrated turnarounds in the history of the sport. And Knoblauch was the spark plug. He was the player setting the tone at the top of the lineup. The one disrupting pitchers before the powerful hitters behind him even came to the plate. When that team's World Series trophy was lifted, his fingerprints were all over it. The city of Minneapolis did not just cheer for him, they claimed him as their own. They believed he would be a Twin for life. And for several seasons, that belief was completely reasonable. Over the next 6 years, he did nothing but confirm that claim. Between 1991 and 1997, Chuck Knoblauch built a case that he was the finest second baseman in the American League, rivaled only by Roberto Alomar, who is widely considered one of the greatest to ever play the position. Knoblauch was fast, instinctive, and technically exact. He could drag a bunt down the line, pull a hard single to right field, or take a walk and immediately steal second base before the pitcher had a chance to adjust. The opposing team knew every time he stepped into the box that the next few minutes were going to be complicated. He made the game difficult for everyone trying to stop him. The hardware reflected the excellence. He was named an All-Star 4 times, 1992, 1994, 1996, and 1997. In 1997, he won the Gold Glove Award for his defense and the Silver Slugger Award for his offense. In the same year, at the same position, that dual recognition in a single season is not common. It reflects a player operating at the highest possible level in both phases of the game simultaneously. His speed was relentless across his entire career, never once slowing to the point where it stopped being a weapon. He stole 25 or more bases in 10 of his 12 professional seasons. His 276 stolen bases with the Twins remain the franchise record for the post-1961 era. No Twins player has surpassed that number. He was not a one-dimensional threat. He hit for average, worked counts, got on base, and made the defense organize itself around him just by standing at second base after a single. ESPN called him fundamentally sound. Every syllable of that nickname was earned through years of consistent, professional, technically polished baseball. That was the Chuck Knoblauch that Minnesota loved. That was the one who made the coming collapse so hard to believe. But in the late 1990s, the foundation began to crack. The Twins were declining. The roster around him was getting weaker season by season. The wins were harder to come by, and rarer when they did come. The team was heading toward rebuilding, not contending. Knoblauch, a man who had experienced a World Series championship and wanted that feeling again, grew impatient with where things were going. He made his desire for a trade public. And in Minnesota, that announcement did not land quietly. It landed like something breaking. The 1991 team was sacred to Twins fans in a way that goes beyond ordinary sports loyalty. It was a statement about what a small market team could become. It was proof that hustle and fundamentals and collective effort could beat bigger markets with bigger wallets. And Knoblauch had been the face of that proof. The idea that he was choosing to leave, that winning in Minnesota was not enough for him, felt deeply personal to the people who had poured their loyalty into him for 7 years. It felt like he was telling them that what they had shared was simply not worth staying for. In February 1998, the Twins sent him to the New York Yankees in exchange for a group of young players that included pitcher Eric Milton and shortstop Christian Guzman. Over time, that deal helped the Twins rebuild and eventually return to contention. But in the moment, the emotional damage in Minneapolis was done. Knoblauch had chosen New York. He had chosen winning over loyalty. At least, that was how the people left behind saw it. And Minnesota did not forget. They kept track. They waited. The clearest proof of that came in 2001, when the Yankees visited the Metrodome and Knoblauch stood out in left field wearing pinstripes. The Twins faithful responded with a fury that literally stopped the game. They threw hot dogs and coins at him. The objects rained down from the stands toward the man in the opposing uniform. The game required a temporary halt. Knoblauch stood there in that left field grass and absorbed it, surrounded by the noise and anger of a crowd that had once celebrated his every stolen base. That moment was not just about a baseball game. It was the physical and public expression of a city's feeling of abandonment. He had left them, and now he was standing in their house wearing someone else's jersey. The hot dogs and the coins were the most Minnesota way imaginable to say, "We remember." It started in 1999. The player who had been nicknamed fundamentally sound, the Gold Glove second baseman with clean mechanics and a decade of elite defensive play behind him, suddenly could not make the most routine throw in baseball. Second base to first base. 60 feet of air between his hand and the first baseman's glove. A throw he had made perfectly tens of thousands of times. A throw so fundamental that every Little League infielder learns it in their first season on a field. He could not do it anymore. Not reliably. Not at the level Major League Baseball demands. The problem was so visible that it became a nightly conversation around the sport. Fans at Yankee Stadium would tense up the moment a ball was hit to Knoblauch. Broadcasters would hold their breath mid-sentence. Everyone watching knew what might happen next. And the collective anticipation of the bad throw added its own weight to the mental load he was already carrying. His error total jumped from 13 in his first Yankee season in 1998 to a league-high 26 in 1999. Almost every single one was a throwing error. The ball would rocket out of his hand at the wrong angle and fly over the first baseman and into the crowd. It would skip off the dirt and careen toward the dugout. It would leave his fingertips with a strange, chaotic unpredictability that no one watching could explain and no coach could seem to fix. The Yankees tried working with him. He tried working with himself. Nothing held. In 2000, an injury year that limited him to fewer games, he still committed 15 errors. The rate of error per game had barely improved. The problem had not gone away. It had simply been interrupted by the absence of opportunities. And every time he returned to the field and tried to make that throw, the loop started again. Fans stared, commentators ran out of words, and Knoblauch had nothing to offer in the way of an explanation, because there was no simple one. What was happening to him had a clinical name: focal dystonia. In baseball culture, people call it the yips. And while that word sounds almost casual, what it does to a professional athlete is anything but. The yips are not nervousness. They are not a confidence problem that a pep talk can fix. They are not something a decade of professional experience automatically protects against. In fact, research suggests that experienced athletes who have spent years perfecting a movement are often more vulnerable to this kind of collapse than beginners, because the disruption of an automatic pattern is far more disorienting than never having the pattern in the first place. Sports psychologist Charlie Mayer, who worked with the Cleveland Indians, preferred to use the phrase misplaced focus when describing the condition. The idea behind it is this: an elite athlete's physical movements are stored in the brain as automatic programs. The athlete does not think about releasing the ball. The movement happens the way breathing happens. But when the brain shifts from running that program automatically to consciously monitoring every component of the movement, the program breaks. The moment an athlete starts thinking about how he is throwing the ball instead of where he is throwing it, the throw has already been compromised. For Knoblauch, every bad throw added weight to the next one. The memory of failure fed the fear of the next failure. The fear then produced the failure. The loop had no natural exit, and no one standing outside it could pull him free. From a brain science perspective, researchers connect the condition to the basal ganglia, the structures deep inside the brain that store and execute learned motor sequences. When those structures break down under extreme and sustained stress, the brain loses its ability to carry out precise physical movements at an automatic level. Some researchers point to dopamine, the chemical that allows the basal ganglia to communicate with other brain regions, as the point of disruption. When dopamine pathways are thrown off by fear, pressure, and the constant anticipation of failure, movements that were once perfectly automatic become unreliable. For a baseball player, the release point of a throw is a movement calibrated by years of practice. When that calibration breaks, a Gold Glove winner can start throwing the ball into the seats. Some observers have also pointed to a deeply personal factor in Knoblauch's case, one that is not proven but is difficult to ignore entirely. His father, Ray Knoblauch, the man who had taught him the game from childhood, was in the terminal stages of Alzheimer's disease during the 1999 and 2000 seasons. Ray passed away in 2002. Certain psychological observers have proposed that the throwing crisis was connected in some way to the loss of his father's presence as a corrective voice. Ray had always been the one to identify mechanical problems and fix them. With his father no longer able to provide that guidance, some observers suggest that the errors reflected an internal search for help that could no longer come. That is a proposed view, not a diagnosis. But it adds a dimension of sadness to a story that was already painful to watch. The moment that made the whole crisis undeniably real for the public came on June 17, 2000. The Yankees were playing the Chicago White Sox. Knoblauch fielded a ground ball hit by Greg Norton and moved to throw to first base. The ball flew off his hand and went entirely wrong. It sailed over the first baseman, hit the roof of the Yankees' dugout, and ricocheted into the crowd with a hard, unpredictable spin. The ball struck Marie Olbermann, the mother of broadcaster Keith Olbermann, directly in the face. It broke her glasses. She needed medical attention at the stadium. Olbermann was working the game for Fox at the time. He watched his monitor, recognized the angles of the stadium, and understood immediately that his mother had been hit. He said on air that Chuck Knoblauch's throwing problem had gotten personal. The New York Post and the Daily News both ran the story on their front pages. Marie Olbermann reportedly handled the sudden attention with warmth and good humor, showing more composure about the incident than the man responsible for it. But for Knoblauch, the throw had crossed a line. An innocent person sitting in the stands had been hurt because he could not control where the ball went. The yips were no longer an athletic story. They had become something with real consequences for real people. That pattern would not stop there. In December 2007, another dimension of the story became public. Senator George Mitchell published his report on performance-enhancing drug use in Major League Baseball. The report named dozens of players across the sport. Some of the most celebrated athletes of the era appeared in its pages. Chuck Knoblauch was named in the document. Unlike several prominent figures who refused to acknowledge the findings against them and maintained their denials publicly, Knoblauch eventually admitted to using human growth hormone. The admission came after the detail in the report left little room for a credible denial. The report detailed that Brian McNamee, an assistant strength coach with the Yankees, had obtained HGH from Kirk Radomski and had injected Knoblauch with the substance between 7 and 9 times during the 2001 season. 7 to 9 injections. In one season. That is not an athlete trying something desperate on a single bad night. That is a repeated and deliberate choice. Knoblauch's stated defense was that the drug was used strictly for injury recovery and not to improve his athletic performance. He pointed to the fact that 2001 was his worst statistical year as a player, as evidence that the substance had no enhancing effect on his game. Some observers found that argument credible. Others pointed out that the timing, the volume, and the circumstances made the injury-only defense difficult to accept without question. But what is certain is that the admission placed a shadow over the period when he was at his most dominant. Some fans and analysts began looking back at his 1995 through 1997 seasons with new and uncomfortable questions. The ethical stain did not simply vanish because the batting average in 2001 was low. The doubt had been introduced into the record, and it would remain there, permanently, alongside the stats. By 2001, his defensive collapse was so total and so public that the Yankees had no choice. They moved him from second base to left field, removing the pressure of the throw to first entirely. The thinking was reasonable. Take away the specific movement that was breaking down, give him a different set of responsibilities, and see if the player underneath the yips could resurface. But relocating the position did not restore the player. The damage was deeper than geography. In the 2001 World Series, one of the most dramatic and celebrated fall classics in recent memory, Knoblauch batted .056. He was removed from the lineup before the final game was played. The man who had once been the heartbeat of a championship team, the player whose stolen bases and disruptions in the early innings set the tone for everyone hitting behind him, sat on the bench at the most important moment of the season. That image alone captures the totality of the fall. From cornerstone of the 1991 championship to spectator in the 2001 series, a decade of decline compressed into a single moment on a bench. After 2001, he signed with the Kansas City Royals. He played 80 games in 2002, hitting .210 with only 11 stolen bases. The speed that had made him a franchise record holder with the Twins, the weapons that had made him one of the most disruptive leadoff hitters in the American League, were entirely gone. The body that had stolen bases at will for over a decade was no longer capable of doing it consistently. The bat that had earned him a Silver Slugger was producing nothing worth noting. When no team extended an offer for the 2003 season, he retired at 34 years old. A career that once seemed destined for Cooperstown ended without a ceremony, without a press conference, and without the kind of goodbye that a player with his resume deserved. The game simply moved on without him. For a stretch after his retirement, Knoblauch stayed away from the headlines. But that period of quiet ended on September 25, 2009. Police were called to a home connected to him that evening. He was arrested and charged with assault of a family member involving choking, which is a third-degree felony under Texas law. The victim was Stacy Stelmach, his common-law wife, the woman sharing her life with him. According to the police affidavit filed by the Memorial Villages Police Department, Stelmach told officers that Knoblauch had struck her in the face and then used his hand to apply pressure to her neck. When officers arrived, they observed swelling near her eye. They documented visible redness around her neck, consistent with the account she had given them. The physical evidence matched what she described. It was not a case of conflicting accounts where the truth was difficult to locate. The injuries were observable. The testimony was consistent. The police affidavit captured it all in plain language. Reports from the district attorney's office also noted that Knoblauch had combined alcohol with Xanax before the attack took place. He was not simply overcome by a moment of uncontrolled anger. He had been mixing substances that affect judgment and lower inhibition before he chose to put his hands on her. That context matters. In March 2010, he entered a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of misdemeanor assault. His sentence was 1 year of probation and a fine of $1,000. For a man who had spent years earning the salary of an elite professional athlete, that financial penalty was not even an afterthought. For a man who had committed a violent act against a woman who trusted him in her own home, the legal consequence was essentially invisible. The system had offered him the smallest possible consequence. And rather than using that outcome as a reason to change, he carried the same destructive patterns with him into the years that followed. In March 2014, there was a separate incident. Knoblauch allegedly pushed a police officer during an altercation. He was charged with interference with police duties. That charge did not exist in isolation for long. Just a few months later, in July 2014, police were called to his home again. The call came in at 3:49 in the morning. Think about that time for a moment. 3:49 in the morning. Officers arrived to find Knoblauch in an intoxicated state. His ex-wife, Sherry Knoblauch, told the officers what had happened. He had come into the bedroom where she was sleeping alongside their child. Their child was in that bed with her. He walked in, intoxicated, in the middle of the night, and he started yelling at her because she was not in his bed. He grabbed her by the arm. He took hold of her and drove her head into the wall. When she tried to get away from him and move toward the door, he picked up a humidifier and threw it at her. The officers on the scene documented every visible injury. There was a large bruise on Sherry's arm. There was a scratch across her face. There was a visible knot on her forehead from the impact with the wall. Their child had been present in the room. The child had been in that space while it was happening. Knoblauch was taken into custody and charged with assault on a family member, along with the prior police interference charge. He had now been arrested twice in 5 years for violent behavior against a domestic partner. 2 different women, 2 different incidents. The same use of force. The same pattern of aggression. The same refusal to stop. The Minnesota Twins had been preparing something entirely different for August 2014. In January of that year, a 62-member committee composed of media representatives, club officials, and fans had voted to elect Chuck Knoblauch to the Twins Hall of Fame. The induction was planned for August 23, 2014, at Target Field. It was meant to be a celebration, a homecoming, a chance for the franchise to honor what he had contributed in 1991 and throughout his years in Minnesota. It was meant to be the moment that closed the distance between Knoblauch and the city he had left. But when the July 2014 arrest became public, the Twins did not take a week to deliberate. They did not call a committee. Within 24 hours, the induction was canceled. On July 24, 2014, the team released a formal statement. It cited recent news reports surrounding Chuck Knoblauch and direct communication with the former second baseman. Twins president Dave St. Peter and the Pohlad family made their position clear. His conduct was inconsistent with the honor the team's Hall of Fame was designed to represent. They moved fast. They spoke directly, and they did not walk it back. Historians of the franchise and of baseball broadly recognized the significance of that decision. It was one of the first times a major franchise had removed a former player from its honored circle, not because of on-field failures, gambling offenses, or anything connected to how he played the game, but because of how he treated people when no stadium lights were on him. The Twins drew a line that most sports organizations do not draw. They said clearly that what a man does when the cameras are off is part of who he is, and that who he is has to align with the honor being given. That decision has not been reversed. As of 2025 and 2026, digital discussions among fans reach the same conclusion consistently. His repeated and documented offenses, combined with the perceived arrogance of his exit from Minnesota all those years earlier, left him with almost no one willing to advocate for a reconsideration. The franchise that gave him his career, that celebrated him as a cornerstone of its greatest championship, looked at what he had done and drew a clear, public line. Some fans point to comparisons with Kirby Puckett, another celebrated Twins legend who also faced personal allegations later in his life and who has continued to be honored by the franchise. That comparison still generates debate, but most observers note the distinction between a single allegation and a repeated criminal pattern with multiple victims, multiple court appearances, and documented physical injuries each time. The HGH admission adds yet another complicating layer to how history looks at his career. Some observers have proposed that his mental and physical collapse in New York may have been connected, at least in part, to the removal of chemical support during a transition to a far more demanding environment. In this view, his body and mind were struggling to perform without a substance they had been relying on, while simultaneously managing the loss of his father, the hostility of the New York press, and the internal shame of the yips playing out in front of millions of people every night. The intensity of New York sports coverage is unlike anything in Minnesota. Every mistake is dissected. Every failure is replayed. For a player already fighting against the fear loop of the yips, that kind of relentless attention only fed the problem. Some observers believe the combination of all of those pressures, the chemical change, the personal loss, the public failure, created a perfect storm that a person with even the most stable foundation might have struggled to survive. That is not a proven analysis. It is a proposed view, but it adds to the complicated picture that surrounds his dominant years. Whether his best seasons were fully earned on pure talent and discipline alone, or whether some part of that excellence was chemically supported, the doubt now exists as a permanent fixture in his record. That is one of the costs of the admission. Not just the current shame, but the retroactive uncertainty it places on everything that came before it. What is not in doubt is the arc of his behavior after baseball ended. The 2009 arrest, the alcohol and Xanax before putting his hands on a woman's throat, the minimal consequence that followed. Then the 2014 arrest, the intoxication at 3:49 in the morning, the child in the room, the head into the wall, the humidifier thrown at a woman trying to get away from him. These are not isolated moments. They do not exist separately from each other. They are connected pieces of a pattern. The same escalation of force, the same presence of substances, the same disregard for the person in front of him. A pattern does not form from a single bad night. It forms from a way of operating in the world. And the pattern that emerged from Knoblauch's post-career years tells a very specific story about who he was when no one was filming. When you place the 2009 arrest alongside the 2014 arrest, when you note that 5 years passed between them and nothing fundamentally changed, you are not looking at a man who stumbled. You are looking at a man who chose. Repeatedly, with full knowledge of what had happened before. When placed against the full arc of his life, from the broken leg at Bel Air High School, to the World Series ring, to the throwing crisis, to the Mitchell report, to the arrests, what the pattern reveals is a man who was never truly able to face the weight of his own choices. On the field, the consequences of his decisions were public and painful and visible to everyone watching. Off the field, the consequences were hidden inside private rooms and documented only in police reports that most fans never read. The terrible crimes that define his legacy at 57 are not only the charges filed in 2009 and 2014, they are the deeper betrayal of everything his talent made possible. He was born into a baseball family that gave him a head start most players never receive. He earned his career honestly, with work and discipline during his early years. He stood in front of filled stadiums as a champion. He was loved and celebrated by entire cities. He had the kind of start in life that most people only get to imagine. And then, through a series of choices he made in rooms where no one was watching, he surrendered everything that his talent had built beyond the numbers. The Hall of Fame induction, the goodwill of the communities that had cheered for him, his standing in the sport he had once represented at the highest level, his relationship with his own family. All of it gone because of choices he made when no cameras were on him. The stat line stays. The 1991 ring is real. The stolen base record is in the books. None of that is being rewritten, but the full picture of who Chuck Knoblauch is includes everything outside the white lines. And that full picture is one that neither Minneapolis nor the broader baseball world is willing to honor. The Minnesota Twins drew a line in July 2014. They drew it quickly, and they drew it clearly. President Dave Saint, Peter and the Pohlad family made a decision that historians have called one of the most significant in franchise history, a recognition that the numbers on a baseball card come second to the conduct of the man who earned them. That judgment still stands. No ceremony has replaced the one that was canceled. No committee has revisited the vote. The line has held. And in a world where powerful institutions regularly look away when a celebrated athlete is involved, the fact that this line held means something real. There's a version of this story that ends with the 1991 World Series confetti still falling. There's a version where the spark plug of the worst-to-first Twins stays in Minneapolis, finishes his career at home, and walks into the Hall of Fame on a summer day with the crowd giving him back everything he gave them. The music playing, his family on the field, the Twins honoring him the way he once helped them earn the right to be honored. That version never happened. The version that did happen still carries a lesson worth keeping. Talent does not protect anyone from the consequences of how they choose to treat other people. Achievement is not a wall that moral failures cannot climb over. Championships do not last forever when the person who earned them keeps tearing down what those championships were supposed to mean. A Gold Glove and a Silver Slugger are not character. 4 All-Star appearances are not morality. They are baseball. and the communities that invest themselves in athletes have both the right and the responsibility to decide who they want to honor when they look beyond the baseball. The Twins made that decision. They said conduct matters more than championships. And when the moment came, they meant it. That is not a happy ending, but it is an honest one. And honestly, it might be the most important ending this story could have. If this video gave you something to think about, drop a comment below and tell us where you stand. Should the Twins ever reconsider the Hall of Fame decision? Or does the repeated pattern of behavior make that permanently off the table? Subscribe to the channel if you are new here and give this video a like. It helps this story reach the people who need to hear it.